Hi, class. Our group read Pushout, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools by Monique W. Morris, and our group members are Avery, Benny, James, myself, Samantha, and Monique. Each one of us will be sharing a summary from each of the 5 chapters with you today. We learned about the experience of Black girls in schools, out on the streets, and in juvenile detention centers. We learned how they are often mistreated, misunderstood, judged, and often offered no support for their educational or emotional needs. You will hear how they pushed out of learning spaces and end up in situations that are just heartbreaking during our presentation today. We hope your eyes are opened as ours were, and that you can learn something from this presentation. I'm going to pass the floor to Avery now.
Hello, my name is Avery Mission. Today I'm going to be presenting Chapter 1 entitled Struggling to Survive. The image is actually from the film Pushout, and it says that schools punish Black girls for who they are rather than what they do. This is a great summary for the entire chapter. So let's get into what the chapter was about. First, the author goes over what it's like to be a Black girl in America. She expresses that labels such as ghetto, ratchet, loud, angry, and others all affect Black girls and how they live their lives in society, how they're perceived by others, how they're perceived by their teachers, are all informed by these labels that are out there. I actually want to read a quote from the book where the author says that to be ghetto represents resilience, to be loud is to demand to be heard, to have an attitude is to reject invisibility, and to be fabulous is to revise your socioeconomic condition. So these girls are actually using these labels as a tool for resilience and resistance, and we're not recognizing that. So we need to recognize the challenges that girls face and how they use them to their own advantage, to their strengths in the classroom, just to be able to survive. This leads into age compression. We adultify Black girls. We don't give them the childhood that they deserve. We say that they should know better, when in reality, we need to be validating their experiences. The author calls for intersectionality. She wants us to see our girls as Black and female, and in some cases, poor. We need to be seeing these separate identities as one whole and how it informs their experiences. She says we need to combat this colorblind culture that says everyone's the same, because the truth is there's not. There's different experiences that Black girls face, and for a while, their experiences have been invisible to us. We haven't been validating them as we should. This leads to a lack of access in quality education. Girls are often put into low-income schools where there isn't as many services. When they are in schools, sometimes they're taken out of classrooms through expulsion, suspensions, getting removed from the classroom. And even when they are in the classroom, the author says that the curriculum does not address the girls' experiences or their needs. And when this happens, do they really have equal access to education, is what the author asks. She says that when Black girls aren't represented, when their history is erased, are they being excluded from the curriculum? And the answer is yes. To further this point, she asks, what is pushout? So pushout is when Black girls are criminalized by the school's beliefs, policies, and actions they use. Like I said, expulsion, being surveilled, being monitored, being hyper punitive, which means over disciplinary. What this does is it strains Black girls' relationship with school, pushes them out of the school entirely, and exposes them to further harm, such as sexual exploitation, abuse, and more. Pushout can happen through having those chaotic and disruptive learning spaces where it causes girls to feel unsafe. When they feel unsafe, not only are they unable to learn, they actually can turn towards violence. They don't feel like it's a safe area. Another big factor of pushout is teacher-student relationships. What the author does is takes interviews with the girls, and from them she finds that to be ignored is a traumatic experience for them. They will ask questions in class, and the teacher will say, "Why are you asking so many questions? Why do you have an attitude?" Will remove them from class, will not hear their needs to be helped or assisted after class. These all create pushout for the girls. Lastly, the author really emphasizes the permission to fail. Teachers give students permission to fail by using their implicit bias to lower expectations for them. They believe that Black girls will underperform and therefore lower their expectations instead of raising them up for Black girls. What implications does this chapter have for us as teachers? First, we need to check our bias. Implicit bias and then attributional stereotyping, where we take these stereotypes and these words we hear and attribute them to our students. That needs to be monitored by ourselves. We need to make sure that our expectations are raised and that we're giving students the support they need rather than ignoring them. We need to ensure that our classroom environments humanize and validate their experiences. They are marginalized in society. We need to ensure that our classroom is a safe space for them, outside of all the stuff they already deal with. We can do this by actively combating the stereotyping, the misrepresentations, and the mistreatment of Black girls in our classroom. So if we hear a student say something, we should do something so that we ensure that class is a safe space and that we avoid pushout, but rather we're pulling them back into the classroom and connecting them with the education they deserve.
Okay, so my chapter is titled A Blues for Black Girls When the Attitude is Enough. In the previous chapter, Avery had mentioned labels that Black girls have, such as loud or angry. This chapter fully dives into the Black girl attitude. The author, Monique Morris, argues that Black girls are often criminalized and punished for their behaviors that are a result of their trauma, such as acting snappy or disengaging from school. The Black girl attitude is an exaggerated stereotype of Black girls. They are perceived in society as being snappy, eye and neck rolling, hands on hips, posturing, finger snapping, overbearing, and loud, which leads us to zero tolerance policies. These are rules and practices that emerged by criminologist George L. Kelling and James W. Wilson. Zero tolerance has its origins from the Columbine shooting to protect students from guns. It suggests that small criminal acts are indicative of more severe negative behavior that can manifest later. So this brings me to the effects that these policies targeting Black girls' attitudes have had. For one, it's led to the implementation of school resource officers, or SROs for short. Zero tolerance policies were enacted to prevent a more serious crime or outcome down the road. However, all it's done is lead to more severe punishments, and this is especially true for Black girls who, even for simply speaking up or raising their voice in the classroom, could be perceived as a threat. This led to the removal of a 6-year-old girl at the beginning of the chapter named Celicia Johnson from her classroom because she threw a tantrum in class. Police came in, arrested the girl, and even hauled her to a police station. These policies have also led to a stark increase in suspensions across the country. The book states by 2009, Black girls were 52% of girls getting out of school suspensions. And lastly, it also mentions a concept known as willful defiance. This is a way for schools to punish students, which specifically looks at Black girls for not following orders. Examples include refusing to remove a hat in school or a verbal altercation with a teacher. But this type of climate only serves to foster a hostile environment and pushes Black girls out of school. So lastly, implications for new teachers. Students can tell when they're being treated differently, no matter the age. Many, if not all, of the examples that were used and shared by some of the interviewees were not even girls showing attitude at all. It was just the way teachers, security guards, admin, SROs, and other adults perceive them to be. This chapter proved why an implicit bias is such a scary thing to possess. Most of these girls simply wanted to be heard. This is especially true for Black girls who were treated differently due to being perceived as having an attitude. So implications for a new teacher would be creating a positive classroom environment where students can feel safe. It's important for us as educators to maintain healthy student-teacher relationships with our students so we can understand where they're coming from and not simply brush off behaviors as an attitude. A student-teacher relationship with healthy communication has been shown to be key in fostering greater classroom understanding of behaviors and academic achievement. Without it, Black girls are perceived as being troublesome, speaking out of line, or showing attitude when there's simply frustration that needs to be alleviated by the teacher or another adult on the campus. And with that, I'll pass it on to James for chapter 3.
Everybody, my name is James, and I will be going over Chapter 3 of Pushout, titled Jezebel in the Classroom. Just a quick note before I start, there's a lot of dense information in this book, and Chapter 3 is where it does start to get a little bit dark. This chapter went over a historic exploitation against Black women and how that has transferred into sexual victimization of Black women children specifically. So that is just a fair warning before I start. So it's important to start, what is a Jezebel? Because this chapter is titled Jezebel in the Classroom. So Jezebel originally was a biblical term for a wicked woman who coerced the king of Israel into marrying him. And so that turned into early modern slang, the early 20th century, and moving forward, a Jezebel was a woman who was wicked, shameless, sexually coercive of men, and it was usually referred to as a derogatory term for women of color. And then that moved us into the term ratchet, which we have talked about and was all throughout this book, which is a low class or trashy person, generally describing women of color. It has a little bit been reclaimed and can be used as a term of affection, but not always, and that is just the historic definition of it. So that is the evolution. So how has history led us here? Because there is historical context set in this book that is seen in the lives of the interviewees. So Black women almost throughout history have been seen as second class and lower citizens. An article written in 1902 was a colored woman, however respectable, is lower than the white prostitute. So we're comparing Black women to prostitutes, and they will always be lower than them, is what an article in a prominent newspaper said. So that was common belief. And we can see that historic, lower than sexual people translate directly to, there's some context in this book. This one girl said that she ran from law enforcement and she was arrested and confined to a detention facility, and she was on the run because she was avoiding going to school and being a prostitute. So we see that direct historical link in which we compare Black women to prostitutes, and that's all they're good for, historically is what they said, to Black girls being criminalized for being sexually exploited. And what are the implications and ramifications of this? So Black women students are punished instead of being supported. They're criminalized for being sexually abused because they can't go to school. They're victims of sex trafficking, and that leads judges to ordering them to go to school, but then they still can't because they're still being sex trafficked and victimized, and then they're arrested for defying a judge's order. History has rippled this effect out. The Black women are offered less mental and educational support than other groups, according to this chapter, and instead of being pulled out of situations where they're being victimized into a supported environment, they're being pushed out of the supportive environment into being victims, which is the title of this book. So what can we do to help as teachers? Looking forward, we can build relationships with students. If we know a student's being victimized, we can treat them with all the support structures that are there. We put them together with students who are succeeding to help lift each other up and guide them and support them in the future.
Hi, everyone. I'm back. My name is Samantha Miranda. I'm covering Chapter 4 of Pushout, which is titled Learning on Lockdown. In this chapter, Monique Morris discusses the girls' experience of learning in juvenile detention centers, which she learned through her observations, studies, and interviews with the girls. This chapter looks at how the girls do not have or receive effective learning in these centers. They do not have support for healing from their past trauma, and they go through a failed credit recovery program and pathway. There's still a focus on discipline, and overall, we just have to remember that they're still just kids. According to the book, Black girls make up 35% of US juvenile correction centers, even though they are 14% of the US girl population. These girls are continuously forgotten in these centers. Sorry, they're continuously forgotten in these centers. And due to this, their supports for both their education and healing from past and present trauma is unavailable. Their treatment in these centers is also, as my group describes, heartbreaking. It is an overall shared experience through many girls that Morris interviews that learning does not happen here and that they do not want to learn here. This is not because they don't want to learn in general. They would love to learn because these girls understand how important education is. The classrooms and learning materials here are not welcoming, they're not interactive or challenging in any way. A few quotes are on the screen. Mia says that she can't learn here, and that's because of just the atmosphere. Same with Portia, it's very depressing. And Portia also thinks the work is way too easy. She discusses how it's just worksheet after worksheet, and often the girls get them done very quickly. It's not challenging in any way. The girls here have also gone through sexual abuse in their homes or on the streets, as James addressed in chapter 3. The girls could also be survivors of physical, emotional, verbal abuse from their homes, their families, or schools that they are a part of. Juvenile detention centers have no good support system in place to help these girls heal and overcome from their trauma. They often add to that trauma. Moore shares an observation she had of a girl named Jennifer and a staff member from the center. And the staff member told Jennifer to sit her ass down when she wanted to talk to somebody else, when the staff member wanted to talk to somebody else. Morris just finished talking to Jennifer a few days before the day about how Jennifer thought it was really important for staff members, both in the centers and in education spaces such as schools, to be protecting and not triggering. So these staff members' words were not kind and could have been triggering to many girls. And Morris had this realization that I put on the screen that she states juvenile detention centers are not trauma sensitive, and they never will be. Next, many girls here are on deep credit recovery. They'd like to get back on track for their education. But the process is inconsistent because the girls do not receive the same credit as public schools in the same way, and they receive it in smaller amounts. And not all districts follow the same credit path. So these girls are from all over and they go back to different districts. And so not everything they do in juvenile detention centers will maybe count towards their district. Most girls are confused by the process, so while they want to make up their credits, they often don't. The centers still have a focus on discipline. We have heard about how the girls were subjected to discipline and zero tolerance policies in public schools, and that treatment is still in place when they're in detention centers. The girls are still being pushed out of learning spaces for asking questions, having attitude, talking back, and one interview said she got kicked out for finishing work early. They're also given suspensions as well, and these suspensions are and sound like a form of solitary confinement, Morris states. They have no recreation, which is their free time at night, and they also eat their meals alone in their room. So the girls are still being pushed out of their learning spaces, even in detention centers where they're trying to help them get their education, or the goal is to help them continue to get their education. It's important to remember that these are just kids. The girls are often locked up not to violent criminal offenses. And overall, they just want to learn. They want to have a supportive force behind them, and they want to be able to have a chance at a good life. Monique summed up the goal of this chapter and the implication very nicely in her class conscious notes, so I quoted it here, and she stated, ultimately, the author argues that we need to repair this failure in order to ensure access to education for Black girls in the juvenile court system. So we need to fix the failure of the system to help girls get their education they deserve. And a quote says, the structure fails to meet the girls where they're at and guide them through their problems. So ultimately, we need to meet the girls where they're at, both in our public classrooms and in these detention centers. An implication for a future teacher, as all of us are, is to make sure that we have these supports in place, we have encouragement, we have empathy for these girls, so we can help them while they're still in our classrooms and they don't end up here. Thank you for listening. I'm going to pass it over to Monique for chapter 5.
I'm in chapter 5, repairing relationships and rebuilding connections. And here we have our lovely author, Monique W. Morris. So chapter 5, I took this from the book on page 174. I'm going to start off with a little quote. It says, I'm mad at myself that I couldn't juggle both. So what this means is Black girls internalize very early on the idea that their well-being comes secondary to others. And this chapter focuses on a specific person, and her name is Heaven. She is known to be smart and capable, according to her teachers, and she would go to school but skip some classes because she didn't see how some classes would be useful for her. So she enjoyed her physiology class, and in this case, it was about the human body, learning about the human body. Although she did love that class and enjoy learning about it, because she didn't like the teacher, she would skip it. So in that sense, that's kind of where the student-teacher relationship was bad. So she would skip that class, and she also had a boyfriend, and she put her boyfriend's education first. So she made sure he went to school and he got his high school diploma. And she was never worried about herself. Evan was the kind of person who cared about others and put herself last, even though she knew very well that education is important, and she knew that having an education is something that can't be taken away. But in this case, it seems like it did for her, because she chose to put her boyfriend's education first before hers. So she blamed herself for not being able to be with him all day and manage her own daily obligations. And here's the problem with that, because I would like to just look at the book for a second. And this is on page 174 as well, in the third paragraph. The problem with that is the idea that Black girls have to hold the pain of Black boys, even at their own expense, is a form of internalized sexism. But when it's couched as a matter of being a ride or die girlfriend, many girls never see that by accepting these conditions, they become complicit in their own oppression. For girls like Heaven, getting an education is not only a rehabilitative act, it's an act of social justice. Okay, so here we have implications. So as a teacher, there is a need for alternative approaches to discipline that focus on repairing relationships and rebuilding connections rather than punishment or exclusion. So we need to restore justice, which prioritizes community building and repairing harm. And here we have our conclusion. So Morris summarizes the key findings of her research and provides a call to action for readers to take steps to address the injustices faced by Black girls in the educational system. Morris argues that Black girls face unique challenges in schools, including biased discipline policies, low expectations from teachers, and a lack of support for their academic and social emotional development. So these challenges can contribute to the term pushout, the pushout phenomenon, in which Black girls are pushed out of school and into the juvenile justice system. And this can have a long-term consequence for their life chances and well-being. So in this case, also being pushed out into the streets where they have to learn to survive. But this concludes our symposium for Pushout for our group, and we hope you enjoyed it.